Hello everyone and welcome to another random bits and pieces segment for my brain, and today, sit a while for we are having another tutorial for Franchise Hockey Manager 7. Somebody asked me to make another tutorial video that would explain how to really build a lineup and everything in ways that would make sense. So I kind of touched about it in the previous videos, but I didn't really go in depth about it. So today that's all we're gonna do is look at things like ratings, what you should be looking for, ways and maybe some tips to build a team that should be competitive. And yeah, so before we start, this is my first video with my brand new computer. So I ordered a war machine almost. This is honestly the biggest desktop computer I have ever owned. It is massive. It is also pretty powerful. Hopefully everything sounds great. One thing though is I had a monitor that was older, and I don't have the right connections on my new computer here. So if you see me turn like this, that's because I'm looking. So I hooked up my work monitor to my new computer right now until my new monitor comes in. So you know, if I'm constantly looking over there, it's just to make sure that everything's still working and everything. I'm not being distracted by anything really. I don't need anything to get distracted. I've proven that quite a few times. But anyway, so I just wanted to bring that up. I did a couple tests, make sure that the audio was fine, and it sounded fine on my part. If you hear something different, please let me know. That's the fun thing about a brand new machine is, you know, you have to tamper with all the settings with your stuff again, because I did not do an image. But anyway, I'm not gonna get into that. All right, so that's out of the way. So so I believe it's a username, Stoner Matt, that asked of me to go a little bit deeper about what to expect or what to do to build a good team. So I'm going to start with goaltending. And I'm gonna try to cover, because of course I don't know what all you play. I tend to play mostly historical, so I'm gonna try to cover like historical and, you know, current day as well, because things don't exactly work, or at least not everything works the same way during those different time frames. So for goaltending, I will say right now, you typically do not need a 5-star goaltender. Okay, if you have one, that's great. You know, if you draft one and he turns out to be a 5-star goaltender, that's, you know, that's excellent. But if you build a pretty strong team, you can definitely get by with a starter that's a 3 or 4-star goaltender. Now, there's kind of a caveat to that, and it is if you play historical, especially I tend to play around the 90s. That's, you know, that's where I'm the most comfortable. During during those years, really good starters and a lot of starters would play a lot more than they do in 2021. So a guy like Brodeur would play, like, you know, 74 games a season, and then he would go out on record and saying, well, I could play every game, I don't feel like I need a rest. um, there's a year that I think Grant Fuhr played like 78 games for the Blues or something like that. I don't have the exact numbers. So if you play historical, you can totally get away with, you know, having a 3-4 star goaltender and then having a 1.5 star backup, because your backup is barely ever going to play. That's just the reality of how things were back in those years. Now in 2021, things are a lot different than that. You need 2 competent goaltenders at the very least. Goaltenders don't play as much, and it's kind of like energy management. I would compare that to, if you're more familiar with baseball, now they're really big on, you know, pitch counts and everything, right, for pitchers. Back, you know, in the 80s and 90s, pitch counts was a very foreign thing, so it's kind of the same thing here. So just see your goaltender a little bit like a pitcher if you're into baseball. Like, in 2021, they don't want a rookie to pitch more than a set amount of pitches and everything. And of course, you have your veterans that are well known, that don't really have a limit or anything like that. But it's a little bit the same thing with goaltenders. So if you play modern day, you're going to need two decent goaltenders so that you can get through the season. So I would say at least, a 3.5 and 2.5 goaltender, 2-3 stars goaltender that might split it, maybe a 4 and a 2.5, 2-star goaltender, something like that. You want something to be able to get you through the season. Now that's ideally. Everything that I'm going to bring up today is ideally you want those things. In the most perfect of worlds, it's not always possible, right? You can't always trade for a player that you absolutely need. Sometimes you throw everything you can in a trade and you just can't get it. So a lot of times the best way is to just groom those players. You draft them, you develop them, you use them. But of course there's also a lot of lots of variations depending on your scouts and everything. So you might be seeing a goaltender as a 4-star goaltender on another team, and then you trade for him and it turns out he's a 3.5-star because your scouts were not really accurate with him. So that's something to keep in mind, and that pretty much covers it for goaltenders. As far as play style and of course you want to look maybe at the ratings a little bit and everything, see where your goaltender is maybe a little bit better and everything. But as far as do I need more rebound and positioning and everything, personally I tend to try to build from the back end with a really good D, and I haven't found that it makes a huge difference. Now, if you have a D that's that's maybe not as good at handling the puck or something like that, maybe you want to look at a goaltender that has stronger rebound control and everything, because your D is not really good at getting the puck back and moving it up ice. So maybe that's something you want, or maybe things like low shots and recovery, you might want to have that a little bit higher as well. It really depends on the composition of your team, but generally speaking, I try to have a strong D enough that the goaltenders' ratings don't matter. When I say that, obviously if I won't have a goaltender that has 7 everywhere. What I mean is that, the 18 can be, pretty much anywhere. It doesn't quite matter. Because my D is usually well-rounded. So yeah, that's pretty much it for goaltenders. To me, goaltenders is the easiest one because first, I don't think you need a 5-star goaltender that you pay a lot of money to be, your number one. And 2, depending on the era you're playing in, either you get a really good starter and kind of a crappy, well, not crappy, but kind of a lesser backup because he barely will be used, or if you're playing modern day, you go with 2 pretty decent goaltender that can share the load. So that's gonna be it for goaltenders. I'm going to go ahead and move on to D now. So there's a few different ways to build your D. Yeah, who would have thought? So if you've watched my series, you know that I'm pretty big on puck-moving defensemen. So what that means is that, you're looking at a guy like Thomas Chabot, for example. So you're looking at a guy, of course, that has good passing, puck handling, probably some offensive read, having some speed is pretty good as well. So I like defensemen that are able to move the puck out of the zone, but you cannot only have defensemen like that unless they are pretty well rounded, and that's what we're going to get at here. So when I build a squad defensively, okay, so you have three pairings for a defenseman, right? Your first, second, and third pairing. Usually, I like to have my first two pairings that are going to be around. That are going to have good. No, I just wanted to make sure that the mouse cursor was showing. So I'm gonna want defensemen that are pretty strong in those two here, in two-way defenseman and mobile defenseman. That's for my two first pairings. So you want to have defensemen that are able to move the puck, and it's okay. It's okay if, for example, one of them is stronger as a shutdown defenseman, as long as they have decent like passing and puck handling, and or either that or some acceleration and agility and everything. So basically, what you want is for your defensemen that play the most. So your first and second pairing should be the ones playing the most. You want for them to be either good at passing the puck out of the zone or skating themselves out of the zone. So that's where those physical ratings here come into play. If they're great at both, that's even better. But sometimes they're not. Sometimes you're gonna have one that's really good at passing the puck, and that's okay. And sometimes they're a little bit better at just skating the puck out. But I would say for my top four defensemen, I'm looking for guys that have a pretty high number here. So usually for my first pair, I'd like for both of them, and again, it's ideally right that you sometimes don't have that luxury, especially if you start as an expansion team or something like that. You're gonna have to do with what you have, but ideally I like for my first pair to have at least a 15 in one of those two here. For the second pair, I'm ready to go down to 13 or 14 in one of those two here. And keep in mind, that's not everything here. So you can look at other ratings here as well, and make sure that they have good, acceleration, speed, and stuff like that, or good passing and everything. You want your guys that play the most minutes to be the most efficient at taking the puck and getting it out of your zone. So that's what I'm looking for when I'm building my top four at D. I'm looking at guys that are good in the two-way defenseman areas of the game. They can be better at one of those. That's fine, but that number here needs to be fairly good, and I'm looking at those here. My third pair, I don't care as much in the way that I don't necessarily look at those numbers here. I mean, if they're high, that's cool, but that's not necessarily what I'm looking for. So your third pairing, and that's only the way that I look at things. Other people might tell you differently. My third pairing is usually my pairing that is going to have my quote-unquote specialists. So it might be a guy that has a pretty high quarterback or playmaking defenseman or point shooter, like one of those here. So my offensive specialist is gonna have a high number here and if the number here in two-way defenseman is not really high, then that means that they're probably not as good defensively. So if we take a look at where's my friend, he's right here, my friend Eric Brandstrom here. All right, so that's maybe not the best example here, but some of his best ratings are as a rushing defenseman and quarterback, right? So quarterback is something that I would look at to man the power play. If you look at his defensive defenseman stats, they're not very good, right? So 8-8, definitely not a punishing defenseman at a 5 and everything. And I guess I forgot to mention that usually, typically, when you're looking at ratings here for the roles, you usually want to have at least one role that's a 10 to play in the NHL. Anything under 10 is really pushing it. So you want at least something that's a 10. And also keep in mind, if you're looking at a guy in the AHL, He might have good numbers here, or anywhere in the ratings, in the role ratings, he might have good numbers there, but that is compared to the AHL, because your player is in the AHL at that point. If you promote that guy, like for example, if Brandstrom was in the AHL right now, you promote him to the NHL, then he might be like a 9, 10, 10, 9, so keep that in mind. So if a guy has good ratings in the AHL and you call him up, those ratings are going to go down also. The accuracy of those ratings for players on other teams is going to vary depending on your scouts. So make sure you have good scouts so that you have the most accurate information for that. And even then, you might have the best scouts. Sometimes they're going to screw up. So keep that in mind as well. When you look at a guy on another team and you see a 17, and then he gets to your team and he's a 15, it's still pretty good, but not as good as what you expected. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So that's for my offensive specialist defenseman. So as you can see, his defensive ratings are not all that great, but he's good at puck handling, passing, acceleration, and agility. So he's a good mobile defenseman, right? So I talked about the ability to take the puck out of your zone. So Erik Brandstrom is good at that. When it comes a time to, hitting people and defending and everything, he's not that great. So he's great once we get possession of the puck in our zone, but when it's time to take the puck away, he's not the best. And on the other end of the spectrum, you can have a defensive specialist defenseman, which, for people that don't know much about hockey, so when you talk to people that don't know a whole lot about hockey and you say, oh yeah, I like this guy, he's a good offensive defenseman, it sounds like an oxymoron. It's not. It's hockey jargon and everything, but when you're not familiar with the sport, what do you mean offensive defenseman? That sounds weird. So defensive defenseman probably fits the title a little bit better. So Braden Coburn probably should. Let's see. Probably Gus Branson is going to be a pretty good example here. Yeah, he's definitely a good example of what I would consider a defensive specialist defenseman. So as you can see, I definitely don't want that guy to play on the power play, right? A 4 as a quarterback, that's terrible. Keep in mind what I said, you want at least a 10 to be competent at the NHL level, so a 4 is just not cutting it. And you can see that, his good stats are a lot in different places than Chabot and Brandstrom that we looked at, right? So offensive ratings are really not all that great. Oh, I'm not even sure that... Alright, so the mute button on my microphone is not working, so I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure why. I'm gonna need to look into that. That's odd. But anyway. Alright, so... so you can see that his offensive ratings are not all that great. Shooting accuracy is really low. Offensive read is not very good. Passing is not very good. So you definitely don't want that guy to play on the power play or anything like that. However, you can see that he has pretty good mental and defensive rating. Don't mind the face-offs. Defensemen all suck at face-offs in the game because they never, very extremely rarely take face-offs. I guess it happens. So he's good at hitting, stick checking, and all the stuff for, defensive defenseman. Balance and strength is pretty high as well. Some decent stamina. So you can see that his strengths are more in air, so that's a guy that I would put on my third line, probably with Erik Brandstrom, so they kind of complement each other. And that's something that you can do for your other pairs as well. Keep in mind there's more than one way to do things, right? So being a Sens fan for years, we had Mark Method playing with Eric Carlson. Mark Method was definitely not the, a juggernaut offensively or anything like that. But what that did is that it would let Eric Carlson, who was an offensive juggernaut, that was giving him more freedom to go on about his business on the ice, trying to create plays and everything, because he knew that Method would be back, and that Mark Method was more of a defensive defenseman, so he knew that he was in the back to cover his butt. So, and that was our first pair, so you can definitely do that. You can do that through your entire lineup, and actually that's kind of how the Sens are set right now. So you have Shabbat, that's more offensive, with Zaitsev, who's more defensive, even though he's not necessarily all that great. Then you have Riley, that's kind of all well-rounded, with Zub, who's kind of well-rounded, and then the third pair has been kind of a mismatch of stuff. So yesterday it was Coburn with Gottbranson. They are both more defensive defensemen. I don't necessarily like that kind of match. So that's kind of what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that if you can help it, you should probably have like two defensemen that are good at being two-way defensemen. Or if you can't, you should probably try to have defensemen that complement each other. So, an offensive defenseman with a defensive defenseman, but you usually don't want to have two really strong offensive defensemen that are not very good defensively together, or two defensemen that are, not all that great at moving the puck together, even though they're really good at, hitting and everything. Then they get the puck and, they're not very good with it. So you usually want to avoid having two like that as well. So I kind of told you what I like to do. I like to have 4 strong two-way defensemen that are here, and then my third pair I like to have what I call my specialists. So a defensive and an offensive defenseman, but sometimes you don't have that luxury. So what I would recommend doing is to try to pair a guy that's really good offensively with a guy that's really good defensively, and then put maybe your 2 best two-way defensemen together, and then try to fit the other ones into that kind of scheme. That's usually what's going to give you the best results as far as defending. Now, if your ratings are really poor, it doesn't really matter, but with decently rated defensemen, you kind of want to have them complement each other on every pairing. So when it comes time to set your power play lines and everything, obviously you want a defenseman that's really good in one of those here, or at the very least at two-way defenseman. And same for when you set your penalty killing lines, you want you want a defenseman that are really strong at defensive defenseman, or at the very least very good at two-way defenseman. Enforcer is kind of a wild card. Typically, if your player, regardless of if he's a forward or a defenseman, typically if their highest rating is an enforcer, they're usually not going to be very good at anything else at the top, usually. So I very seldom use enforcers. Sometimes I will when I play in the 90s, because it was a little bit more of a thing, but especially for goon and enforcer, those 2 roles are really more about face punching and everything. Not a big fan of that, and there's not a whole lot of that going on in the NHL in 2021 anymore, and usually the guys that fight can also play hockey. But back in the 90s, you had guys that were in the lineup that would play 3 or 4 minutes a night, and their only purpose was to punch some other dude's face on the other team who was also playing just 3 or 4 minutes a night, and then you had that going, and then that was it. So yeah, I don't really look at enforcer. Maybe agitator, but not on the agitator. I will look at for forwards maybe, but not for defenseman. For defenseman, I really focus a lot on two-way defenseman and then offensive and defensive defenseman, and I already explained the rationale behind all of that. Another thing, some teams sometimes like to carry 7 defensemen. So what's going on with that is that usually the 7th defenseman that's going to be carried is a guy that's pretty good offensive defenseman, but he's terrible at defending or not very good. So they kind of carry that extra defenseman as like a power play specialist that's going to come in if there's a power play or something like that. You don't see that very often. Usually when a team plays 7 defensemen, it's because there's like a late injury, like during practice or during the warm-up or something like that, and then they dress as 7 defensemen just to have enough bodies. But I do remember in the 90s there was a player named Greg Allgood. That guy played for Boston, and Boston would carry him pretty much only to play on the power play. So they didn't trust him much in his own zone, so he was pretty much only playing on the power play. But in 2021, you don't see that all that often. It happens sometimes, but it's pretty rare. All right, and the game does support a 7th defenseman that you can put in here. I never personally use it, so I cannot talk about if the game handles that good or not. So if you want to try it as an experiment, you can. I just don't have any opinion one way or another to see if the computer handles that pretty good. But I would think that you would put your 7 defenseman in there, and then that would give you, more leeway about whom you're putting on the power play. And speaking of power play formation, if you're playing historical, it's going to be your typical left wing, center, right wing, and 2Ds usually. But in 2021, most teams run with 4 forwards and a defenseman, and I believe that's why they have that extra slot there labeled as P and not D. Left point, right point, and then you have D here for defenseman, and then you would put your forward there, I guess. So yeah, keep that in mind. If you play older style hockey, 3 forwards, 2 defensemen for the power play. If you're playing in 2021, 4 forwards, 1 defenseman on the power play. That's how teams do it nowadays. Alright, so now we're going to look at forwards, and there's probably going to be a little bit more to talk about for forwards here. So who am I going to take a look at? Let's take a look at our friend Jimmy Stew. Alright, so Jimmy Stew, Tim Stutzel, his stats are not all that high. Keep in mind he's only 18 years old, so he still has time to grow into his potential. What potential did they give him in the game? I'm kind of curious. 5-star, good. That's what he should be. Alright, so alright, so there's more to talk about for forwards because you dress more and you have 4 lines, which means that you can approach that a few different ways. There's a few different ways that do work. And also it depends, again, which era you're playing. So regardless of the era that you're playing, you usually want your top line to be your best players, right? Because they are going to be playing the most. So When I'm looking at building my first line, I'm going to be looking at the top 5 categories here. I don't really care. I'm going to look at who's the best at either goal scorer, offensive forward, playmaker, power forward, or two-way forwards. Two-way forwards do have their utilities on the top line. Probably the best example of a really good two-way center playing top line would be Patrice Bergeron in Boston. So he's a pretty elite two-way forward. That means that they're usually as good offensively as they are defensively, but you want a big number in here. So kind of like with my top defensive pairing, I want at least a 15 if I can help it, of course. So I want at least a 15 in one of those categories here. It can be a sniper, it can be a Gretzky's office, a counter-attacking forward. I don't really care all that much. What I care about is that for my first line, it needs to be at least a 15. And just like with defenseman, you want to kind of have a way to complement all of the players. If you have, 316 snipers, that's great and everything, but if they are not very good at passing the puck, that's going to be tough to score goals despite them shooting the puck like you wouldn't believe, because they all have the same skill set. And it's true in most sports. You want complementing skill sets so that the team as a whole is more difficult to play against. In baseball, if you're playing 1992 baseball, and you have 8 Otis Nixons in your lineup, sure, you're fast and you're gonna hit for contact and everything, but you're not gonna hit many home runs. You're not gonna hit with a lot of power most of the time, so you're gonna be lacking kind of that. So then pitchers are going to adjust, the defense is going to adjust, and then you're gonna get stifled because most of your players all play the same. So it's kind of the same thing here. So there's a way of thinking in the NHL right now, and it does make sense. And it's been around for, I would say, at least 10-15 years. And it is to... So your line is 3 players, right? You have a center and 2 wingers. But teams tend to nowadays focus on duos. So you have usually like 2 guys that play together really well, and then they kind of rotate a third player there that kind of fits with them, maybe, or at least for a little bit. And then when it doesn't work anymore, they kind of take that guy off, try another one, and everything. You see that all the time. I mean, if you look, right now in Ottawa, you have Tim Stützle playing the left, and then Batterson playing the right wings. So those are almost always on the same line, and then they kind of rotate centers. So Tierney's played there, Anisimov's played there, Derek Stepan played there before he got hurt, Josh Norris played there for a little bit. So they kind of are trying different centers, but Tim Stützle and Drake Batterson are pretty much always the same. If you look in Toronto, it's the same with Auston Matthews and Mitch Marner, right? Those two are pretty much always the same. And then they played Wayne Simmons on that other wing. They've tried Joe Thornton. I think Galchenyuk played there a little bit. So they're trying, different players. But Matthews and Marner are almost always on the same line together. So teams tend to focus on duos, and that's fine to do that. But usually the duos kind of complement each other. So if you're looking in Toronto, Auston Matthews is pretty much the shooter on that line. Doesn't mean he can't pass or anything, just that usually he's the one that's, with a great shot and everything. And Marner is more like the playmaker type of player, so they complement each other very good. So you want to look at something like that. Typically, your best playmakers are going to be the centerman, but not always. Just like I just said, in Toronto, Marner is a winger, but he's a lot more the playmaker than Matthews is. And Matthews plays center, but typically your center is going to be your best playmaker on the team. or on the line. So again, you want to look at something that's 15 or above here to play on your first line. That means that they are really good. Of course, closer to 20 is the best. If you have a guy that's a 20 in something, that means you want to try to build your line around that guy. So if you have a guy, for example, that's 20 as a perimeter shooter, you want to give him somebody that's a good playmaker, setup man, or good at Gretzky's office, so that they can go ahead and shoot the puck in the net. So you want to really try to balance things out. I'm a little bit different for my forwards than I am with my defenseman. So for my defenseman, remember, I like to have my top two pairings mostly as two-way defenseman. Not so much for my forwards. As much as I can avoid it, I'm gonna try to get at least somebody that's a good shooter and a good playmaker on one line. And then usually I'm gonna complement it with either one of the other three. So I don't mind having one two-way forward on a line, but I usually wouldn't put like 3 two-way forwards on the same line, unless they would be really, 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 really high. Usually I'm going to look more for offensive here. For my first line, for sure. For my second line, I'm still looking for scoring. Your second line should be providing secondary scoring, should be able to put the puck in the net as well, just maybe a little bit less. So again, I'm looking at 13s and 14s, maybe 15s if I have some spares. So again, I'm looking at those 5 top categories, and I try to avoid having 3 guys from the same category, so that I can diversify what the line can do. So again, I try with what I have to put a playmaker with some form of goal scorer, and then somebody else. So that's for my top 2 lines. The third line is very dependent on what era you're playing, I would say. So back in the 90s, your third line was definitely a checking line. It was a line that was usually not necessarily the best offensively, but they were usually pretty good at countering the opponent. So back in the 2000s, the Sens made it to the Stanley Cup Finals against the Anaheim Ducks, and the Anaheim Ducks had that third line of Rob Niedermayer, Sammy Paulson, and Travis Moen that stifled our first line the entire series. We couldn't do anything, and that's because they were there. It was their third line, and it was their checking line, and they were very, very, very good at their role. So if you're playing more in the 90s, start of the 2000s, you want for probably your third line to be either from two-way forwards, maybe power forward. So maybe power forward, two-way forward, grinder, and defensive forwards. So you kind of want to build a line with guys that are good in those here. Since we're looking at the third line or something like that, you want to look at like probably a 12, like a player that's around a 12, 11, 12 should be okay for playing on the third line in those roles. And yeah, that keep in mind, the role rating is kind of the most important thing that you're looking at as far as where to slot somebody on the line. I mean, I said you want somebody that's at least a 15 to play on your top line. I mean, if you have somebody that's a 19 grinder, probably not a good idea to put him on your first line. So I did say look at the top 5 for the third line. If you're playing in the older days, you're looking at power forward, two-way forward, grinder, defensive forward. That's what you're looking at, trying to build that checking, grinding line that's tough to play against. If you're playing more in the 2021 era, your third line is I almost want to say it's kind of like your joker or your jack of all trade line. So your third line is going to be a line that usually has speed, and that usually is more around the two-way forward type of player. Um, or it's gonna have some rookies, like Tim Stutzel would fit probably on that third line here. With some of his stats here. So there's not really a real perfect way to build a third line in 2021 because a lot of teams do things a lot different. So the Sens have a little bit more of a typical third line from like the older days where it's a little bit more meant to be a solid checking line. The thing is that they have a lot of speed, and I would say that the players on that line would be considered as aggressive for checkers, especially Connor Brown and Nick Paul are both probably very aggressive for checkers, so that they would fall more into that category. But you know a lot of times they play with either Colin White or Josh Norris, which are younger players and everything. So that's why I said it's really hard to pinpoint the third line in 2021 because it's really going to depend on what you have available to you on your team. If you have a lot of young players, then you can put your speedy young players on the third line to get experience, get some play time and everything, and then put them maybe on the power play if they are good enough and things like that. Or if you have a little bit of an older team, or even if the younger players that you have are more of the grinder type, that's fine as well. So there's not really a set way to do the third line. Personally, I like speed. I like speed a lot. So usually I'm gonna have people on my third line that are going to have some speed, probably some stamina, maybe a little bit of aggression, and checking, because I want my third line to be a up tempo line with that are good at aggressive for checking. That's what I like. But I mean, if I have so many young players that I have so much talent that it's coming through every pore on my body, then I might put up a really speedy offensive third line. So that's why I said it's kind of like a joker line. There's a lot of ways that you can shape your third line and still be efficient. The fourth line, back in the 90s and everything, that's where you would have some enforcers with some grinder type of players usually, and probably a defensive forward. So you would be looking at those three last categories here, and you would put whoever, um, and for that you're looking at least at a 10 or a 11, and that's fine. But sometimes you're gonna see like a 17 goon, and usually they're pretty pathetic at everything else. But you're gonna see like 17 goon or enforcer. That really means that they belong on the fourth line and to play very little, because they're gonna be face punching somebody, and then their night of work is over after that. Nowadays the fourth line is usually a line that can play, so that's the difference with the fourth line in the 90s. Usually the fourth line in the 90s, you would put the guys there that are washed up veterans, or your face punchers and stuff like that. Nowadays you have a lot of speed on the fourth line, and I would say that in 2021 typically the fourth line is probably what the third line was back in the 90s. So your fourth line usually should be in 2021 probably like two-way forwards, grinders, defensive forwards, maybe somebody that's an enforcer if you have one. But in 2021 you shouldn't have a whole lot of those. So you would be looking at two-way forward, grinder, defensive forward, enforcer. Again, you're looking at a 10 or 11 for your fourth line. I mean, if it's higher than that, obviously that's great. But you want at least 10 to say that you're competent enough to play in the NHL. So that's what you would be looking at. And of course, all of the if you mouse over goal scorer, it tells you which stats are important. So for perimeter shooter, wow, okay, red is an important speed, so important skill, wow. So you would be looking at puck handling, shooting accuracy, offensive read, acceleration, agility, balance, and speed. So the higher those are, the higher the perimeter shooter stat is going to be. Same for garbage collector, except that it's different ones. Excuse me, my mute button doesn't work. I'm sure I'm gonna figure it out eventually. Yeah, so that's pretty much what you're looking at as far as stats and the different role ratings, and I hope that for the most part that I've answered Stoner Matt's questions. So to kind of to bring it up in a wrap, goaltending, you don't really, if you build your team kind of how I explain, you don't need the best goaltender in the league to win. I mean, don't get me wrong, don't put an alpha star goaltender in there, although it seems to work for the computer. Usually doesn't work for me though. So a 3.5 star goaltender is usually going to be plenty enough to win if you have a strong D. I'm a firm believer in having a very strong defense. That's usually where I try to get the best the soonest. Doesn't always happen that way, but that's what I try to do. Keep in mind, you want players that are good at moving the puck out there. Okay, if you put 6 guys that are going to hit and stick check and all of that good stuff, but they have problems handling the puck, you're going to allow a lot of goals because you're not going to be able to get out of your zone. It's true in real life and it's true in the game as well. So I personally prefer to have my top 4 being mostly two-way defenseman type of players that may have that may be a little bit stronger in offense or defense, but that are pretty well rounded, and then my bottom pair being my quote-unquote specialist. But you don't have to build it that way. If you put one specialist with another one on each defensive pair, you should be fine as well. You want at least on each time that your defensemen are on the ice, you want to have at least one of them that's good at handling the puck or skating the puck out. That's usually what you want to try to do. And then for forwards, forwards is pretty straightforward to me. You have your top 2 lines should be your goal scorers and your playmakers and power forwards and all of that good stuff. Your third line really depends on which era you play. If you play, nowadays, you might want to put some, young guys with speed there, or forecheckers with a lot of speed or something like that. Usually speed is kind of the word, basically. And on your fourth line, you want to put your defensive specialists. Speed is great to have for that as well. And if you play in the 90s, put a face puncher there, make the fans happy or something. But that's pretty much it. That's pretty much how I build my teams. Don't forget, if you play in 2021 on the power play, 4 forwards, 1 defenseman that's good at handling the puck, obviously. To kill penalties, it should always be 2 forwards and 2 D-man. If it's on a 5-on-3, 1 forward, 2 D-man is usually what you want to have. If you go to overtime, 3-on-3, overtime, you usually want to have 2 forwards and 1 defenseman. You might want to risk it with 3 forwards. Might not work, but you might want to try that. For the shootout, you should send your best shooters or playmakers can usually dangle the puck pretty good as well. So you want your offensive players there. I think I've covered pretty much everything. I hope that's what you were looking for. I hope that it has helped others as well, of course. Um, and as usual, if something is not clear, if you have questions, if you want to, ask me anything about, how to build a team or anything in particular that you're not too sure about with the game, feel free to ask in the comments. You can also go to my About tab on the channel. There's going to be a way to contact me through email there if you don't want to post your question for all to see. There's no stupid questions, but I can understand if you feel your question might be basic or something like that. I definitely won't judge you, so you can always email me that way. But yeah, and if there's anything else that you would like for me to cover in an upcoming tutorial video, please let me know. I will try and do my best to do that. So I think that's pretty much it for today. My voice is about to leave my body, as it usually happens when I'm doing those type of videos, because I talk for a very long time. But hopefully that was informative. Hopefully that's helpful. So that's it for today, folks. So as usual, I do want to thank you for tuning in, and if you've liked this video, please feel free to like, subscribe, share, comment, all of that good stuff. And until I roll this game again, and we're gonna do the Tampa Bay Lightning stuff again, and that gives you a little bit of time to come up with questions or ideas for a new tutorial video after my next season. Alright guys, take care.